First thing I noticed wasn't my son, it was his hands. He was carrying a tray of dirty dishes from the dining room into the kitchen, moving quickly, head down, the way people move when they're trying not to be seen. I was standing at the side gate of the house I'd bought with 30 years of nursing wages, and I watched my son disappear through the kitchen door like he was the help. I hadn't announced I was coming. I should back up, because this story doesn't make sense unless you understand what I left behind and why. My name is Loretta. I'm 63 years old, and I spent the better part of my adult life working as a registered nurse in Toronto, Canada. I went up there in 2007 when my husband passed and left me with more debt than memories. My son was 22. He had a business degree from Georgia State, a good head on his shoulders, and a house. The house his father and I had paid off the year before the cancer took everything else. A four-bedroom colonial on the outskirts of Savannah, Georgia, worth, at the time, about $800,000, worth closer to 1.2 million by the time any of this happened. I signed it over to him before I left. Clean title, no conditions, no strings. I told him, this is yours, baby. Build something with it. He did build something, just not what either of us imagined. I called every Sunday for the first 3 years. Without fail, 10 o'clock in the morning, his time, noon mine. We talked about everything. His job applications, the woman he'd started dating, whether to repaint the living room. I sent money when I could. Not a lot, but enough to cover property taxes 1 year, a new water heater the next. Then he got married. Her name was Tanya. I'd met her twice before the wedding. Once at Christmas, once at a cookout his cousin threw. She was polite both times. Reserved, maybe. But I told myself that was just nerves. Meeting the mother of the man you love is nerve-wracking. I gave her the benefit of the doubt. The Sunday calls changed after the wedding, not immediately. Gradually, the way water wears down stone. You don't notice it happening until one day you reach out and the surface is completely different from what you remember. First, it was him calling back instead of answering. Then it was texts instead of calls. Then it was, "We were busy this weekend, Mom. I'll call you soon." Soon kept getting further away. I want to be honest here, because I thought about this a lot in the year since. I told myself it was normal. Newlyweds need space. He has his own life. I didn't want to be that mother, the one who suffocates, the one who can't let go. So I loosened my grip. I told myself giving him room was the loving thing to do. Maybe it was. Maybe it wasn't. I'm still not sure. By 2019, I was hearing from him maybe once a month. Voicemails mostly. I'd leave a message. He'd leave one back. We'd circle each other through recorded words like we were strangers trying to reschedule a dentist appointment. When I mentioned it to my coworker Denise, she said, "Loretta, at least he calls." I thought about that a lot. At least he calls. Then COVID hit, and for a few months the calls came back. He was scared. Tanya's mother had gotten sick. The world felt very small and very fragile, and I think we both needed to remember who the other person was. I flew down in October of 2020, stayed for 10 days. The visit was fine, tense in places. Tanya was quiet in the way that felt less like shyness and more like a door being held shut, but fine. My son looked tired. I told myself it was the pandemic. I told myself a lot of things. After that visit, the calls thinned out again. Then they stopped almost entirely. I sent emails. I sent cards for his birthday. I sent a Christmas box. The box came back to me in February, marked undeliverable, though I'd sent it to the same address I'd been using for 14 years. I called his cell, disconnected. I called his cousin. The cousin said he hadn't heard from him either, said there'd been some talk at a family reunion that my son and Tanya had gone through something, but nobody knew details. I thought about flying down then. I want you to know that. I thought about it seriously, looked at flights, took 2 days off approved in advance. Then Tanya's number, the one I'd had stored for years, actually went through. She answered. She told me my son was fine. She said he'd had to change his number because of a harassment issue. She used that word, harassment, and that he'd been under a lot of stress and needed some time before he was ready to reconnect. I asked if I could speak to him. She said he'd call me when he was ready. He did not call. I am ashamed now of how long I waited, 15 months. I called Tanya's number 4 more times over those 15 months and reached voicemail every time. I drove myself half to madness trying to imagine what I'd done, what I'd said, what moment I could point to as the thing that broke something between us. I replayed that October visit until I'd worn grooves in the memory. Had I said something wrong at dinner? Had I been too critical of the kitchen renovation? Had I overstayed? I want to tell you, no, I don't believe that anymore. But at the time I believed it with everything in me, because the alternative, that something was being done to my son, that someone was keeping him from me on purpose, felt too enormous to hold. I am 63 years old. I raised that boy alone from the time he was 13. I know his voice. I know the way he goes quiet when something is wrong. I know the difference between I'm fine and I'm fine. I booked a flight in March of last year. I told no one. The drive from the airport to the house takes 45 minutes if you don't hit traffic on I-16. I hit traffic. I sat in the rental car with the radio off, watching the skyline change, trying to prepare myself for whatever I was about to walk into. I kept thinking about the tray. The image hadn't come to me yet, of course. I didn't know what I would find. But I think some part of me already knew it wouldn't be good. I parked 2 houses down. I'm not sure why. Instinct, maybe. I walked to the side gate, the one that leads to the backyard, the one we installed when my son was 15 because he kept leaving the front door unlocked. The gate was unlatched. I pushed it open quietly, and that's when I saw him. My son. 40 years old, carrying a tray of someone else's dishes due the house his father and I bought with nursing wages and overtime shifts and a loan we spent 6 years paying off. He was wearing a white collared shirt, the kind caterers wear. He didn't see me. I stood there for what felt like a very long time. Then I heard laughter from the back porch. Loud, easy laughter, the kind that belongs to people who are comfortable. I moved along the fence line until I could see. There were 4 of them on the porch. Tanya, her mother, a woman I'd met once at the wedding and who had looked through me like glass, and 2 men I didn't recognize. They were drinking. There was a spread of food on the outdoor table, nice food, charcuterie, and those little stuffed mushrooms my son always made for company because he knew the recipe by heart. Tanya's mother was holding court. I could hear her from where I stood. She was talking about a trip she was planning, somewhere in Europe. She was talking about the house, my house, the house I signed over to my son, like it was hers, like she'd always lived there. I went back around to the front and rang the doorbell. Tanya answered. She took a moment too long to arrange her face into something welcoming. "Loretta," she said, "we weren't expecting you." "I know," I said. "Is my son home?" The pause lasted 2 full seconds. He's in the back. Let me get him." I waited in the entryway. The house had been redecorated. Not just updated, redecorated. The furniture I'd chosen when we first bought the place was gone. The family photos that used to line the hallway were gone. There was a large canvas print on the wall where my son's college graduation portrait used to hang, an abstract thing, all gray and gold. Nice enough, I suppose. But not ours. My son came in from the back. He stopped when he saw me, and for a moment he looked like he was 12 years old and had just been caught doing something he shouldn't. Then he crossed the room and hugged me, and I felt how thin he'd gotten. "Mom," he said. "Just that." "Baby," I said. "Talk to me." We sat in the kitchen, the back kitchen, not the breakfast nook where the guests were, the actual working kitchen, which still smelled like him, like coffee and dish soap. He talked in low tones. Tanya had positioned herself in the doorway. I noticed that. I noticed she didn't leave. He told me things slowly, reluctantly, the way you push a splinter out of skin that started to close around it. About how Tanya's mother had moved in temporarily 18 months ago after a supposed financial crisis that my son had never seen the paperwork for. About how the temporary had become permanent. About how the 2 men on the porch were Tanya's brother and her brother's business partner, and they'd been staying in the guest rooms for 4 months. "Which room are you sleeping in?" I asked. He looked at the table. "Because the master has the ensuite," I said, "and you look like you haven't slept properly in months." He said they'd moved to the small room at the end of the hall. He said Tanya's mother needed the master because of her back. He said it without meeting my eyes. I kept my face still. I have 40 years of nursing. I know how to keep my face still. "And the catering thing tonight?" I asked. He said Tanya's brother had a small catering business. He said he'd been helping out on weekends. He said it like it was a choice. I asked him about his own work. He'd been in project management before. Good job, stable salary. He said he'd been let go 8 months ago and was in between things. He said it quickly, like he didn't want to spend time there. I asked him if he knew how much the house was worth. He said he thought around 800,000, same as always. I told him the county assessor's website listed it at 1.2 million. He blinked. Have you seen the property tax bills recently? I asked. He said Tanya handled the bills. I kept my face still. I'd like to look at those, I said, and the deed if you have a copy. Tanya moved in the doorway. Those are private documents, she said. It was the first thing she'd said since we'd sat down. I looked at her for a long moment. The house is in my son's name, I said. He can share whatever documents he'd like. She held my gaze for a few seconds, then took out her phone and left the kitchen. That night I stayed at a hotel 20 minutes away. I lay on the bed with the lights on and made a list on the back of a receipt I found in my purse. What I knew, what I suspected, what I needed to find out. I called my attorney in the morning. His name is Gerald Webb, and I've used him for estate matters since my husband died. I told him what I'd seen. I told him about the bill situation, about Tanya's mother, about my son's sudden unemployment. Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Loretta, the first thing I need you to do is get me a copy of that deed. I went back to the house the next day while Tanya's mother and brother were out. I'd watched from the street until I saw them leave. My son let me in. We sat at the kitchen table again, and he brought out a folder he kept in the bottom drawer of the dresser in that little back bedroom. He'd kept it hidden. I didn't ask him why. I think I already knew. The deed was in the folder. The deed was not in my son's name alone. Tanya had been added to the title 14 months ago. The paperwork was dated 2 months after my son's job loss, 3 weeks after Tanya's mother moved in. My son's signature was on the document. His hands were shaking slightly when he held it out to me. Did you know what you were signing? I asked quietly. The way he answered, the pause, the way his eyes went somewhere far away, told me everything. He said Tanya had told him it was insurance paperwork, something to do with the homeowner's policy. She put a stack of documents in front of him on a Sunday morning and said the broker needed them by Monday. He said he trusted her. I closed the folder. I told my son I needed him to listen to me very carefully. I told him that what I was about to do was going to feel uncomfortable and scary, and he needed to trust me the same way I was asking him to trust that I was doing it out of love. He nodded. He looked like a little boy. My little boy. I called Gerald from the driveway. What followed over the next 6 weeks was not dramatic in the way television dramas are dramatic. There was no screaming confrontation, no thrown dishes, no moment where someone breaks down and confesses everything in a flood of tears. Real legal processes are slow and quiet, and they smell like paper and waiting rooms. Gerald contacted a real estate attorney who specialized in property fraud cases. We filed a complaint with the Chatham County District Attorney's Office. The basis, potential fraud in the procurement of a signature on a title deed, specifically the misrepresentation of the document's nature and purpose to a financially vulnerable individual. In the meantime, I documented everything I could. The catering shifts my son had been working without pay, money going directly to Tanya's brother's business account. The household expenses, utilities, groceries, maintenance, paid entirely from my son's unemployment checks and his remaining savings while Tanya's mother and brother contributed nothing. Gerald's investigator found that Tanya's mother had no documented financial crisis. There had been no medical emergency. There was no reason she needed to move, and other than convenience. There was also the matter of a home equity line of credit. This was the piece that took my breath away when Gerald told me. 18 months prior, 6 weeks after Tanya was added to the title, a home equity line of credit had been opened on the property. $240,000. The draw history showed withdrawals made over the course of 14 months. Most of them on days when my son was working. He didn't know it existed. When Gerald showed him the paperwork, my son sat in the attorney's office for a long time without speaking. Then he said, in a voice I hadn't heard since he was a teenager, "I want to go home, Mom." I put my hand over his. The DA's office moved faster than Gerald had expected, which he said was unusual, but not unheard of in cases with clear paper trails. Tanya was arrested on a Tuesday morning. Her mother was arrested the following Thursday. The charges included mortgage fraud, elder financial exploitation, which applied because the property had originally been transferred from me, a person over 60, and forgery. The brother was charged as an accessory for his role in directing the unpaid labor. Tanya's attorney pushed back hard. She argued the title change was consensual, that my son had known what he was signing, but the forensic document examiner found what he found: irregularities in the paper stock, evidence that the deed had been inserted into a larger stack of documents, the placement of the signature line in a position that would be consistent with someone signing without reading. My son testified. I sat in that courtroom and I watched my child tell the truth in a quiet, steady voice, and I have never been more proud of him and more heartbroken for him at the same time. Tanya was sentenced to 4 years. Her mother received 3 years, suspended after 18 months pending restitution. The full amount of the equity draw, $240,000, was ordered repaid from assets seized at arrest. The brother took a plea agreement and received 2 years probation and community service. The house remained in my son's name. The fraudulent title edition was voided by the court. Here's what I want to say about the months after all of that, because I think this is the part that matters most and the part that nobody talks about. My son had a good therapist. I want to say that clearly, because I think sometimes people hear a story like this and expect the healing to be as dramatic as the wound. One big cathartic moment, and then everything is okay. That's not how it works. He went to therapy twice a week for 7 months. He talked about trust and about how long he'd known something was wrong and talked himself out of believing it. He talked about what it meant to ask for help and why it had taken him so long to let me back in. I went too, a few times. My therapist asked me once whether I felt guilty for having left. I sat with that question for a long time. I told her yes, I felt guilty for being gone so long. I felt guilty for every Sunday call I let go to voicemail, every visit I talked myself out of, every time I told myself he needed space when what he might have needed was his mother. I don't think guilt is the same as blame. I don't think my absence caused what Tanya did, but I think I could have been more present, and I carry that. What I also carry is the memory of the morning, about 4 months after the sentencing, when my son called me, not a text, not a voicemail, a real call, and said there was something he wanted to show me. I drove over on a Saturday. He'd spent the previous 2 weekends repainting the living room. The color he chose, a warm, deep green, was one I'd mentioned offhand years ago during one of our Sunday calls, when I'd been looking at paint swatches for my apartment in Toronto. I don't know if he remembered that or if it was a coincidence. I chose to believe he remembered. The family photos were back on the hallway wall. His graduation portrait, a photo of him and his father, taken the summer before everything changed. A photo of the two of us on his first day of kindergarten, him holding my hand with both of his, the way small children do when they're not sure what's coming next, but they trust the person beside them enough to walk forward anyway. He made coffee. We sat in the breakfast nook. Outside, the yard was starting to come back. He'd been working on the garden, and the rose bushes his grandmother had planted decades ago were putting out new growth. "I'm sorry it took me so long," he said. I told him I was sorry too. We sat there a long time, long enough for the coffee to go cold, long enough for the morning to turn into afternoon, long enough for things to begin, slowly, to feel like ours again. Some damage doesn't undo itself. But some things, if you're patient and honest and willing to sit in the discomfort of having been broken, can be rebuilt into something that holds. I believe that now. I have too. I think about Tanya sometimes. Not with anger anymore. That passed somewhere around the 2nd month of therapy, when I finally stopped replaying every moment I'd missed and started asking harder questions about what I actually had the power to change. But I think about the choice she made, the calculation of it. She looked at my son, a man who trusted her, who loved her, who handed her access to every corner of his life, and she decided that what he had was more valuable than who he was. That kind of thinking doesn't appear out of nowhere. It grows in the dark, quietly over a long time, fed by something I don't think I'll ever fully understand. What I do understand is what it cost her. Every single thing she'd built on top of what she took, the comfort, the control, the easy laughter on that back porch. It all came apart the moment someone decided to look closely. That's what I've come to believe about the choices we make in the dark. They don't stay hidden, they accumulate, and eventually the weight of them becomes impossible to carry without showing. My son trusted when he shouldn't have, and I know he's still working through what that means about him, about her, about what he missed or chose not to see. His therapist told him once, he shared this with me later, that being deceived by someone you love is not a failure of intelligence. It's a consequence of having an open heart in a situation that required a more careful one. I held on to that. Because I had my own version of the same lesson to sit with, I had an open heart about distance. I told myself that loving someone from far away was still loving them enough. This story taught me that presence is its own form of protection, and that absence, even well-intentioned absence, can leave people exposed in ways you never meant and can't always see from 1,200 miles away. What pulled us through wasn't one dramatic moment. It was smaller than that. It was Gerald answering his phone on a Tuesday morning and taking me seriously. It was my son keeping that folder in the bottom drawer, some part of him holding on to evidence, holding on to the possibility that someone would eventually come and help him make sense of it. It was the two of us sitting in a kitchen that still smelled like him and choosing, slowly, to tell each other the truth. I'm 63 years old. I've seen people walk away from hard things because the hard thing asked too much of them. I understand that impulse, but I have also seen what happens when you stay, when you choose to be honest about what went wrong and clear-eyed about what it will take to make it right, and stubborn enough to do the work anyway, even when the work is slow and unglamorous and nobody is watching. That stubbornness is not a small thing. It might be the most important thing. The rose bushes his grandmother planted are still growing in that backyard. They went untended for a long time, but the roots held.